illuminate these things. Give us a word that works, a word that changes us. And Father, please help us have humble hearts, to be open and willing to change where we be made aware of our insufficiencies, be made to lean on you and realize that we need help in our failures. And Lord, that we also feel loved this morning. Help us to accomplish these things, Father, and give me the words I need to speak. And I pray this all in Christ's precious name, in the power of the Spirit. Amen. This week I was thinking about you guys, the whole lot of you, and I realized that you guys are pretty bad people. So that was a conclusion. I mean it. You're bad people. I was thinking about it, and I'll prove it to you. You don't recycle as much as you should. You're bad people. You don't make it to as many booster club meetings as you ought to, and that means you're bad people. I bet nobody in this room actively gives money to PETA, right? So there you go. You should feel bad. You should feel really guilty for not supporting them. You're bad people. The truth is, you should. Those comments, those sort of sales pitch deals, they're meant to make you feel guilty, right? Kind of drive you into, I guess I should. I think so many organizations use that guilt. So many people use that in their relationships to try to guilt people to do things and make them. And there's a thought, a question, a criticism even, that people view that Christianity as the same thing. Churches, Jesus, they view him with some suspicion. I don't know. I feel like he's just going to make me feel guilty. They're going to just force me to do some things I don't want to do, and out of that guilt, they're make me give them money or volunteer or that sort of thing. And so they come to church and say, it's a good question. It's a valid question. Is Christianity going to guilt me? Is it going to use guilt to manipulate me into doing what they think I ought to do? Is this pastor going to do that? Is this church going to do that? Are these people around me going to try to guilt me into doing what I ought to do, supposedly? It's a fair question. Now, this isn't going to surprise you. I'm going to say that the answer is no. That's not what Christianity does. That's not what this church does. It's not who we are here. But I want to prove it to you. I want to prove to you that we're, as an organization, as a system of relationships and people in this room, that we are not trying to guilt anyone. And you might feel that even at times. Even if you've been here a long time or you've been a Christian for a long time. Being around certain parts of church or certain subjects, you start to just, there's just this guilt just poking at me. The main reason why I know this isn't true is because Jesus doesn't need our guilt. As the Savior, as the one that this is centered on, he doesn't need us to feel guilty to make us do anything. That's not what he came to do. But on the other side, we do need his grace to help get rid of the guilt that we have. So some people look at Christianity and say, no, it feels like you're just going to say some things to make me feel bad about myself so that I do whatever it is, right? I'll get up here and I'll do the whole Sarah McLachlan thing, right? I'll have a baby Jesus and I'll sing, eyes of an angel, right? And I make you, and we just pass the plate around till it's full and then you can leave, right? I don't need to do that. I don't need, because that's not what Jesus' MO is. That's not his plan or his end result. It's not to guilt you. He doesn't need your guilt. But all of us in here do need his grace to get rid of the guilt that we already have. So this is where we're going, and we're going to discuss this in the next passage as we walk through Luke 23 and 24 together for our Easter series. If you want to turn there while we get there, This is building on last week's sermon. Last week we talked about how the guilty shouldn't feel forgiven and the forgiven shouldn't feel guilty. But yet in that story, Jesus was brought before a corrupt court and outwalked all the guilty people feeling forgiven, and the innocent person was somehow condemned, right? There was a twist in that story that said this isn't how it's supposed to be. And as we walk forward, we're going to sort of follow some of this guilt. We're going to follow this guilt. And right now is as he's walking to Golgotha. He leaves this bogus trial, and there's not very long, a few hundred yards before he would be at that hill, right? The hill of the skull, or Golgotha in Hebrew, or Calvary in Latin, right? That's where all those names come from. It's that same place where he would be crucified. So we're in Luke 23, starting at verse 26, and we're jumping in on his way to that place. And this is what it says. As they led him away, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country. They placed the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed him, among them women who were mourning and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For this is certain, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore children, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if such things are done when the wood is green, what will happen when it's dry?" Now, there's some confusing things in here, right? We're talking about wood, we're talking about the mountains, and we're going to sort it out. We're going to sort it out. But what we need to understand coming into the passage is there's basically these two main parts. You have the women, and then you have Simon. So let's talk about Simon for a second. Simon of Cyrene, as we're told in here, is foundational. This is going to lay the understanding for this whole passage that Jesus is in control. He's not a victim here. He's still in control of the situation. It's tempting to want to think of him as a victim, but talking about Simon tells us that no, he's not a victim here. Simon of Cyrene. Just think through this passage for a second. The guards don't have names. Scribes don't have names. The crowd doesn't have names. Nobody really has. But this guy, this is Simon. Not only gets his name, he gets a location. Simon of Cyrene. This is being specific. In Mark's gospel, we learn that he's Simon of Cyrene, father of Alexander and Rufus. Right? There's no mistaking who this guy is. We're being really specific that this guy. Now, why? Why does this guy, who doesn't even have a speaking part, why does he get all this specificity? Well, the answer is, when you think about it, it's pretty logical. The original audience of these Gospels would have known who this was. They would have known who Simon of Cyrene was. I went to Kansas City. I ran into John. Well, John who? John Anders, John Isaacson, John Wayne, Johnny Cash. Like, who are we talking about here? No. I would only tell you who it was so that you would know. Oh, I know that guy. They would know who this is. Now, let me connect some dots for you. Simon from Cyrene, he shows up, and he's going to prove to us exactly that Jesus is in control, because what we see here is God's sovereignty. There's this little detail in this story that to the original readers, the original audience would go, "No way. That's Simon? Like, that's how it started?" Because see, Cyrene was a northern town. It was in northern Africa, right? So he's traveling to Jerusalem to do his thing, to go to the temple. He's walking through, and he gets dragged into this mess. But as he's there, again, walking behind Jesus, he's watching this whole thing. Simon watches this, believes in Jesus, gets transformed, goes back to Cyrene, because we know out of Acts 11, there's a church there that sends out preachers. Some of those preachers are the ones, there's a preacher who in Antioch, lands at Antioch, that's the one who issues Paul on his missionary journey. We get to Romans, Paul writing Romans, and he greet Rufus and his mother, who's become like a mother to me. Okay, so there's a lot of dots here, but follow him. Simon sees Jesus, goes back home, either plants that church or joins that church, brings his family along, Rufus and Alexander. Rufus grows up, he's in the ministry. He's working through this. He's at least following some of these preachers and ends up being a contemporary with Paul. So if you're reading this and you come across the name, like, I know Rufus, that's his dad. Like, that's how this all began. He saw Jesus, he told us, we became saved, and now look at what we're doing. Jesus is in control here. This isn't some random guy in a random crowd pulled out to follow some random execution. This is really, really on purpose. And that should be encouraging to us. It should be very encouraging that even in this detail, God's in control. Jesus is in control here. And we're tempted at this point in the story to kind of view him as a victim. Like a lot of times in the Easter time, we get these pictures of Jesus and the statues of Jesus and whatever, and he's like limp and he's like beaten completely and he's bloody and somebody's usually like Mary or something is like holding him up. Now he did get executed. Like it was horrible and painful, and we know he was obviously struggling to carry the cross. But it's not because he was a helpless victim here. He was still in control. In fact, that's why he starts talking to these women that way. So when you think of Simon, okay, this is a sidebar here. Stop the watch. What if this really horrible thing, this really terrible thing that you're going through, the thing that you wish didn't happen, it seems random and why is this happening? What if this terrible thing is what God's using to redirect your whole life? Simon was just showing up to do his thing in the temple. He gets dragged in. Now he's watching this horrible, traumatic event, but out of it comes a completely different life. And I wonder if you have some things going on that you're like, this random thing happening, it's a struggle, it's miserable, I hate it. What if God is putting you in a position to change your perspective, to change your outlook, possibly even to change your direction? That was free, okay? That was free. First one's free. Tell your friends. That might be something that you need to hear. That might be the key to understanding the situation that you're in. Now, next is these women, these weeping women. So you have Simon, who's really proving this control of Jesus in the situation, and you have these women. This is the other characters here in this passage. These would be professional mourners, right? That's based on the text. I think the best argument is that these women would be what countries still do this, but professional mourning. You would hire them when somebody was being executed or at a funeral, and they would show up and they would cry and they would wail and they would talk about the person and what it would charge the room emotionally. Because if you actually cared about this person, then you're listening to this person go on and on about him crying. Well, then you start crying, and then you're crying, and then we're all crying, right? And that's more of a grieving procedure they would do, kind of a respect for the dead. So they would hire these women to come along and wail and weep but understand that they're hired. Understand that they're not actually weeping for themselves and wailing because they love Jesus so much. So he turns to them and he says some of the oddest things, right? He says, don't weep for me. Don't do that. Weep for yourselves. That's got to be weird. Like, that's got to be a weird moment because you're standing there hired to be a whaler, right? Not like a whaler like shooting the whale, but like a whaler. Whaling's illegal now, I found out. You're supposed to be doing this. You're supposed to be, and you're walking behind him for a while, and then he just stops, and he turns around, and off of the blood just dripping from him, from the whipped wounds, from his eyes are just swollen from being beaten. And he says, you know who's in really bad shape? You. You know who really needs grieving? Is your children. What do you say? What do you do with that? I would be pretty taken back. And I think they were, because they didn't say anything. Now, why would he say that? Why would he tell these women and to mourn for themselves and for their children when he's going through this horrible thing? Number one, because he's not a victim. He isn't helpless here. It's on purpose. And number two, notice what he calls them, daughters of Jerusalem, right? That would be a title referencing like the women of Israel, right? He's talking to them on a national stage. So not just specifically these women, but the women of Israel. And he gives them this crazy sort of warning. In Israelite culture and Jewish culture, it would have been a shameful, very sad thing to not have children. Right? If you were barren or if you couldn't have kids. Today many women are still brokenhearted that they want to have kids and they can't for some reason or the other. But in this culture in particular, it was very heightened. This was a lot of times their identity as a woman, and it was a reflection of how much God loved them, supposedly, right? So if to not have kids would be a really big deal. And he's saying, you know who's going to be best off is all the women who didn't have kids. Because what's going to happen is going to be so terrible that at least you don't have to watch your kids go through it. There's some comfort, right? Well, like what? What kind of terrible news? And it makes us ask the question, well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen what's going to happen that's going to be so bad that you'd rather not even have kids? I mean, that's got to be if you have kids and you know your kids and it's a good day, then you love your kids a lot. And the idea of not having kids it's unimaginable. And he gives this prophecy. Now, this prophecy, the hills coming down, the mountains burying us, this happens to be used in 3 places in the Bible. One is way back in Hosea 6. The next one is here in Luke 23. And the final one is in Revelation. Now, just let me give you just a brief picture of what these are used for. In Hosea 10, you have a prophet writing to the nation of Israel going, look, you guys have messed up so bad. And you've walked away from God. You've rejected God. He made a promise to you. You made a covenant with him. That's what happened, and you've walked away from that. Enemies are going to come. They're going to take over. They're going to exile you. And it's going to be so bad, you're going to wish that the mountains would just bury you. And that happened. Through Assyria and through Babylon, they came in and they killed so many people and enslaved the nation for generations. That happened. Then in Luke 23, Jesus shows up with the same prophecy and says, look, because you're rejecting me now, you rejected Yahweh in his way, so he made a new way. You couldn't live that way. He made a new way through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? I'm God in flesh. Here I am, right in front of you. And they reject him. He says, you know what? Because of that, the judgment for rejecting me, you're going to wish the mountains buried you. Now, here's something for my history nerds out there. Woohoo! Okay, you guys are going to like this. 33 years later, and you can look this up, the Roman Empire comes in and they attack the Jewish nation. 985 towns slaughtered. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish people killed in these battles that went on for 4 years. This tirade against them from the Roman Empire came out. And this was the prophecy. It would have been the women of Israel and their children going through that. Jesus says, you're rejecting me. Here I am offering salvation to you, and you're turning it down. He says, look, you think what's going to happen to me? Things are coming for you. That prophecy is fulfilled. So we see it fulfilled in Hosea. We see it fulfilled in Luke. And then again, it's alluded to in Revelation 6. At the final judgment where Jesus comes to the world, the whole world, and it says people from all walks of life, the rich, the poor, the fat, the skinny, the fat are going a little slower, I guess, but they're all headed to the mountains, right? They're all trying to hide. It says because the world's sort of unraveling in this judgment because they've rejected God. That's a big deal. Now here's the kicker. We saw it happen to Hosea. We saw it happen in Luke already. That prophecy was fulfilled. We're still on this side of Revelation 6. This is still yet to come. So we have these weeping women showing up and talking with God, or talking with Jesus, wailing with Jesus, mourning with Jesus, but it's just an act. It's just a duty. It might even be guilt. You're seeing this horrible thing. You feel sympathetic. Yeah, man, that's a shame. And yet on this side of Revelation 6, our guilt or our feeling bad isn't enough. Just saying I feel bad or even doing it, well, I feel bad, so I'm going to do a little bit of this. Or I feel bad, so I guess I'll do some church stuff. I'll show up and I'll join in the crowd. He says, don't weep for me. Don't just show up and do stuff and then think that's enough. It's not about doing things. Jesus doesn't need our guilt to make us do stuff. Remember, God king of the universe, can do whatever he wants. He doesn't need us to do that. But we need him. We need his grace. Now, we talked about guilt this last week. We talked about guilt and how it's kind of sort of like a pain mechanism. It'll point to what actually is wrong, and that's useful. So here's where this becomes really real for us, is that the guilt you might be feeling, if you don't deal with it, if you don't deal with the actual issue, you're just going to live in it. Right? It's supposed to point out the underlying issue. It's supposed to bring your attention to something. You go to the doctor, you say, I hurt. And they're going to say, where? And you're right here. This hurts. And let's say, okay, now we know what we're dealing. We have a better idea. Let's find out what the cause of the pain is. Most of the time, we don't just want to do pain management. I don't just want to give you a pep talk and be like, hey, I know you feel really bad, but if you give $20 to church, you'll feel better and you can go home. It doesn't work that way. I'm not here to guilt you into something. God doesn't need your guilt. But yet we do need him to remove our guilt. We ended up talking about how the guilty shouldn't feel forgiven, the forgiven shouldn't feel guilty, but the guilty should feel guilty. And that seems sad, it seems hard, but the reason is so that they can become forgiven, and then they can feel forgiven. And if we want to live in that forgiveness, in that healing, that's how we have to go about it. And here's the deal: if you go to the doctor and you're hurting, and it's sort of embarrassing, right? Well, I just doing what I shouldn't have done, and you still have to tell them about it. If you want their help, if you want to deal with the underlying issue, even though it hurts, even though it's painful, even though it's embarrassing, or it happened a long time ago, but you're still dealing with it today, you still have to talk to him about it. And so we have the great physician, right? And you're like, I see what you did with that analogy. Just like that. We need to go to God and talk to him about these things. We need to deal with the underlying issue. So you might be carrying things around from a long, long time ago. But if you think just showing up to church now and again, just giving some money here, just volunteering there, if that's just to try to manage that pain a little bit, you're never going to deal with what's actually underneath. He said, and Jesus is not mincing words here. He says, if that's your plan, then weep for yourself. Don't come here feeling bad and be like, oh, Jesus, yeah, sorry about, well, okay. Any negative emotion you have about church, or you're scared about this, or don't waste it here. You're going to need it out there. You're going to need it in the Revelation 6 prophecy. Because that's not what he needs. He doesn't want to manipulate your guilt into making you do anything. He doesn't need your guilt. But we need his grace, where he shows up and he says, I have some undeserved kindness for you. It's something that we desperately need, that we could never earn, that he gives to us for free. To pull that guilt off. To free us. So again, you might have a past that you hope nobody finds out about. You might have a relationship that continues to heap guilt on. You might have some people that, man, you don't know what to do. And that guilt, it's overwhelming to you. You can be healed from that. That's what grace is for. That's why the guilt is there. Praise God for that guilt, because it's pointing out something. There's a lot of stories about this. You ever heard these stories? You're going, oh, I went to the doctor and I had this pain right here, And so I went and I asked him about it. Turned out it was this terrible disease, but they fixed it. Nobody ever goes, man, I really wish I didn't feel that pain. Boy, that was so inconvenient that it saved my life. We struggle with guilt, but at the other side of it, you realize that guilt is saving me from something. It's pointing out where I need to be healed, where I need grace. Guilt is good when it points us to grace. I hope that maybe you can find some of that healing today by going to God with where you feel guilty. Maybe you say, that's not me, but I actually have this friend who's really near and dear to me, and I know they're drowning in guilt over this or that, or they're too scared to go to church. And they feel like Jesus is going to just beat them to death with guilt. And they couldn't. Here's a truth for you to share with them. God doesn't need their guilt. Jesus doesn't need their guilt. But we do need his grace. And so in order to help that person, maybe you want to invite them to church. Say maybe at 6:30 or at 9 or at 10:30. I don't know. I'm just offering advice. Options. No, but that's a real thing. If there's people in your life that you can help with this, please do. Reach out. And even as Christians, as we're growing into maturity, sometimes we hold on to things. Sometimes we don't allow ourselves to be forgiven because we don't hand it back to God. There is healing. And so this morning, when we look at Jesus and we realize he's not a victim, he's the conquering king. And he doesn't need our guilt, but we do need his grace to be forgiven. That there's a beautiful picture here in this moment of communion where we get to respond to that. Like we get to take a moment and have a physical representation of saying, hey, I'm coming back together with God here. I'm going to deal with that in prayer, and we're going to have a moment where I walk in that forgiveness. So I'm going to invite the elders to come up. And this morning, as we have this chance to respond in communion, and here at Westmark, we practice what's called open communion. So if you're coming here today and you don't know what communion is, or this is new to you, or you're not sure, you have questions, or maybe you're saying, I'm not actually right with God right now, I'm not actually right with my church right now, then we ask that you don't take communion. Just let it pass by. There's nothing awkward in that. Learning about what it is, and that's great. That's what we have. That's what we want here. As you learn together with us, as we practice this together,